read a piece by Matti Friedman. Many of you may know the Atlantic piece that he did, and the previous piece, and I think in the tablet, in fact. And then he gave a lecture in London to the British Israel Action Committee, BIAC, something like that. Anyway, they published Fathom Journal, and Fathom Journal published his speech, and he spoke about the cult of the occupation. And as soon as he said the words cult of the occupation, something clicked for me. Now, as a medievalist, I understand cults. I understand how they operate. And all of a sudden, hearing that the occupation had become cults clarified things for me. So here's where I try and work out what it's clarified. I had a striking conversation recently with someone whose work I much admire. He peppered me with questions about whether or not I supported the settlements, and more generally, favored ending the occupation. When I tried to point out that I didn't think that either the settlements or the occupation were the major issue in achieving peace, he responded, "Nobody will listen to you. They'll accuse you of changing the subject." I thought that was, a little much. But in doing so, this interlocutor spoke for most liberals and progressives in the West, including the President of the United States. In fact, shortly after this conversation, Jeffrey Goldberg published his interview with Obama, in which Obama basically said, and then here was Bibi changing the subject, trying to tell me about the rough neighborhood that he lives in, when the subject is the peace process. And the key to that peace process, of course, is getting rid of the occupation. So it seems a fair generalization to say that for most Westerners who consider themselves on the compassionate left, and who doesn't consider themselves on the compassionate left, the settlements, who on the left doesn't consider themselves compassionate, the settlements, and more broadly the occupation, are unquestionably the most critical obstacles to peace in the Middle East. So strong is this belief that when Israel's democratically elected governments refuse to comply with demands to end the occupation, these people grow impatient with Israel. Given the choice between liberal values and an Israel increasingly, and here I put in brackets, increasingly perceived as non-liberal, American Jews, Peter Beinart argues, will choose liberal values. Or, as the actor Michael Douglas remarked in an event at Brown University, West Bank settlements are, quote, the one issue that has alienated more of Israel's friends than any other. So we're dealing here with a focus on the settlements, which I will briefly argue is crazy, and then discuss what comes from pursuing these crazy ideas. The focus on the occupation and settlements originates in the logic of Oslo, and it entails basically three principles. One, and this is the key one, two-state solution is the only fair and acceptable solution to the conflict between the Jordan River, and the sea. And Israel must concede land for a Palestinian state in the West Bank, land for peace. Two, the Palestinians are a people and deserve a state, and the sooner they get it, the better it will be for everyone. And three, given that Israel is the more powerful partner in the deal and controls the entire territory that must be divided, the burden is on Israel to make concrete concessions of land in order to get peace. All of this seems straightforward, dominated the Oslo peace process, and actually in 2012, a BBC commenter, he runs a panel in which he invites a bunch of talking heads to comment on the events of the week. And he says, and everybody's sort of nodding sagely, he said that you can do the Middle East peace by email. Everybody knows what the solution is. Land for peace.
All of it.
Every U.S. administration since the Clinton failure in 2000 has tried to make this formula work, some even supremely confident at the speed at which they could accomplish it. The real problem arises when this formula fails, as it has repeatedly for over 2 decades, and one has to identify the reasons why it failed. Here we find a distinct tendency to blame the occupier. That's also logical. Generally, those in power don't relinquish it. And those without power, like beggars, can't really be choosers, as the case of Israel in 1947. So when the land for peace deal fails between Israel and the Palestinians, suspicion naturally falls on the occupier. And alas, the deal has not gone through. And indeed, observers, both outsiders and Israelis, have consistently blamed Israel. In particular, its settlements for that failure. So you end up with a phenomenon that not medieval, but historians of apocalyptic movements understand the concept of cognitive dissonance, which is that if you believe that you are in a redemptive process and key prophecy fails, then rather than give up the redemptive process, you come up with explanations for why that's only a temporary failure. So after Oslo, the left, and this is described in a brilliant book, which I've only partly been able to read because my Hebrew isn't good enough, and it hasn't been translated and should be, called The Rise and the Messianic Temptation, the Rise and Fall of the Israeli Left during Oslo. And it describes how after the failure of these moments, each time it would be, we didn't give enough. It's always our fault. So you end up with what I call it kind of, I call it masochistic omnipotence syndrome, which is essentially the belief that it's all our fault, and if only we could be better, we could fix anything. So it's a messianic, it's an omnipotence fantasy that it's all our fault and our behavior will change things. And it's been a characteristic, and I would say, go so far as to say characteristic failure of both Jewish and Western intellectuals in the 21st century on a massive scale. So, the deal hasn't gone through, and Israel has been consistently blamed. This attitude is widely shared among most of today's progressive information professionals, Middle East experts, NGO activists, mainstream journalists, from the big news agencies, Reuters, AP, AFP, New York Times, BBC, down to most of the reporters in the field covering this asymmetric war, whose frame seems to them at least glaringly obvious: the Israeli Goliath and the Palestinian David. Put bluntly, it's the occupation, stupid. In order to press this peace strategy, however, one must assert categorically that if Israel gives up the land taken in 1967, the Palestinians will agree to a two-state solution, in which Israel and Palestine stand side by side. The more aggressively one presses Israeli concessions down to the last inches, obviously, of the Kotel, including the Western Wall, the more assured one must be in principle that there is a Palestinian partner for peace. How could anyone who does not seek the destruction of Israel possibly argue that Israel should undertake painful concessions if the likelihood of that sacrifice is war? On the contrary, as Haaretz put it just days ago when endorsing Abbas's latest proposal, this is a peace-advancing move. So you have this, in order to claim that the solution is ending the occupation, you have to, but people are very rarely forced to explicitly admit that they are implying that if Israel makes this concession, that will be the end of the conflict. And indicators on the ground suggest that this formulation is based on a fundamental terminological misunderstanding of great significance, namely the meaning of the word occupation. For human rights activists, for the progressives, for Haaretz, it's the occupation of the West Bank, beyond the Green Line. As a result, they work tirelessly to preserve that area's integrity as a site for a future Palestinian state and make any trace of occupation and settlement in the West Bank a matter of central importance. To think, noted one settler, if I expand my porch, I'm preventing world peace. And, to some, they are preventing world peace. That is a space reserved for the Palestinian people, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is at the heart of all conflicts. So you get really magical thinking, which I don't want to offend anybody, but I feel that in this time of political turmoil, if one has something to say, one should say something. This is characteristic of a kind of magical thinking that I also think explains a lot of the support for both Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. This is a magical thinking that somehow if we solve the Arab-Israeli conflict, then we can solve, or then all the other conflicts of the world will be solved. Sort of like, what does Luke Skywalker do at the end of the first Star Trek, which is really Star Wars, which is really the fourth Star Wars, where he, hits that one point and blows up the Death Star. We're the point that needs to be hit to blow up the American imperialist hegemonic Death Star. Okay, in Tuvia Tenenbaum's Catch the Jew, the vast majority of Westerners engaged in doing good in the West Bank operate from and continuously articulate this point of view. They fight for the victim, the Palestinians, against the oppressor, the Israelis, who deny their rights. They have maps of the state for whose existence they struggle, and they support the cult by documenting Israeli violations of Palestinian victims' rights with about as much care as they ignore Palestinian violations of Palestinian rights and their dreams of one day denying Jews their rights. Let's call this the Green Line Peace Plan. Israel withdraws from the occupation, end of conflict, land for peace. But when one turns from the Western presentation of how Palestinian leaders think to the way that Palestinian leaders speak, or here I'm saying, if you don't visit regularly or you're not on the mailing list of Palestinian Media Watch and Memory, you're not doing yourself a favor. If we listen to how they speak, Ashkelon, Tel Aviv, Haifa, they're all occupied territory. And putting an end to this occupation, and by that they mean the existence of autonomous Jews in the land between the river and the sea, putting an end to that is, in fact, their goal. So the PLO even has a name for a two-stage strategy in which they'll take what they can get, and this comes in, they first articulated in 74 after the failure of the 73 war to get rid of the Jews. So they say, okay, we'll take whatever we can get and we'll use it as a launching ground to go further. And so from that point of view, the most moderate Palestinian position that we can locate, articulated in Arabic, is a position that basically says, if Israel gives the land back, we'll use that as a staging ground for further attacks on Israel. So I think it's fair to call that land for war. From the point of view of almost all Palestinian voices, speaking in Arabic, the occupation of the West Bank is a minor, even incidental dimension of the much larger problem of occupation, namely the very existence of Israel. Ironically, one of the reasons that Oslo failed, and all its epigonies after it have failed, is because Palestinian political culture found even the two-phased plan dishonorable. Too demeaning. because it meant seeming to make concessions to Israel. One of the primary complaints of both Hamas and Edward Said voiced about the Oslo peace process was how dispiriting it was for the people to see their leaders, and here I'm quoting Said, quote, kneel as suppliants before the enemy. A major part of Hamas's claim to honor, it's one of my favorite topics, honor, shame, is one of the major dimension of Hamas's claim to honor vis-a-vis the shameful PLO came from its refusal to accept compromise, even to talk with Israel, and to pretend to nonviolence. Real men fight, and even children know that cowards talk. As the Arabic slogan, much in favor at the beginning of the Second Intifada, runs, that which was taken by force must be taken back by force. Sensitive to the honor group's fundamental rejection of any compromise with Israel, even Western designated moderate Palestinians like Arafat and Abbas have rejected major chances to set in motion the two-state process. In other words, back in '79, in 2000, and 2008, and throughout the Obama administration, the Palestinians were offered opportunity after opportunity to take what they could get, and, very little imposition on their ability to then continue to wage war on Israel. So it seemed like, from a strategic point of view, this is insane behavior. It only makes sense from the point of view of honor shame, in which even pretending is shameful, and that's what happened to Arafat. That's why he gave his speech in the Johannesburg Mosque about, it was a Trojan horse, because after he signed Oslo, the Muslim world looked at him as a traitor. In this situation, forcing Israel to make concessions to a Palestinian leadership that pursues current practices sends a clear signal for further Palestinian aggressions against a demonstrably weakened foe. In other words, the strategy that BDS is pushing, the strategy even that J Street is pushing, this idea that somehow if we turn enough people against Israel, Israel will, the U.S. and the rest of the world will sort of give Israel the tough love it needs and force these concessions. Is designed to encourage the warlike response of the Palestinians to those concessions. In other words, you can't come up with a better signal to the Palestinians to take up weapons rather than put them down than forcing Israel into making these kinds of concessions, and particularly by forcing it by literally turning the global community against it. In such a situation, one wonders why there's even a Palestinian state at all. Why would this be a priority? Who would come up? Okay, 92, 93, we didn't even know about global jihad. But in 2016, who thinks that a Palestinian state created now would do anything but destabilize the region even more than it already is? So we're talking about, how can I put this, a kind of, to be British and dry about it, a counter-indicative strategy. So, and this is particularly true, of course, when you look beyond to ISIS and so on and so forth. In such conditions, the creation of a Palestinian state now would be disastrous for the whole region. And when one considers the symbolic impact of the blunder of creating a Palestinian state as a magnet for jihadis who want to fight against Israel and stuff, on strengthening and spreading the jihadi apocalypse, I didn't know exactly, on spreading the apocalyptic meme of a global caliphate, the disastrous results of this policy threaten to spread the world over. not land for war, but land for global jihad. Now, one can legitimately differ on these matters, and I say that just to be polite. I really think that anybody who can look at this situation and say, yeah, Palestinians will come around if you give them what they're asking for. Really, well, that's why my book is entitled There's This One, because we're so stupid. So there are a lot of people who do this, and in particular, people who identify themselves as pro-Israel do this. J Street, in particular, Haaretz columnist Akiva Eldar, who argues that the very terrorism that most Israelis take to indicate the implacable nature of their enemies and their reason for not being able to make concessions is in fact the product of the poor Palestinians' desperation and not being able to fulfill their national desires the way that the left knows that they mean to do. And if you listen to people, if you listen to progressives explain to you what jihadis want, it's not what jihadis want, it's not what jihadis are saying they want, it's what they want jihadis to want. They don't tell us, and it's not clear they're even capable of allowing themselves to understand what kinds of beliefs exist on the other side. It's not desperation, it's aspiration. We are dealing with a generation of frustrated people. Why are they frustrated? Because they can't get rid of us. How many of you know the meaning of intifada? Yes.
I do know that fawda in Arabic means chaos, and intifada, from my understanding, is from what I've seen, and from the past two intifadas, it's
Right.
A breakout of massacres.
Well, I mean, it's, that's how it's used. It's, an uprising. But in fact, the original...
Or what do you ever need?
I don't know.
Cheers.
You got a 2-cup solution.
But one smaller. So intifada, as I understand it, because I'm not an Arabic speaker, but as it was explained at the beginning, also Gaza too. So it means the motion that a great beast, a camel, a donkey, a horse, a cow, uses when it shakes its skin to shake off an insect. It's a shaking off. And among other things, that tells you who's the David and who's the Goliath. From their point of view, not from the point of view of the left, but from their point of view, not from... When I say the left, I mean basically this progressive, global progressive left, self-identified, that believe that they are sort of the moral guides of the 21st century. So they tell you that it's an uprising against the Goliath, Israeli, and so on. But in fact, Israel is the gnat, and the shaking off is supposed to chase it away. And when it won't chase it away, there's a real crisis also within the Palestinian community, and that's when you begin to see the emergence of, not the emergence, but the growing popularity of jihadi ideologies. Now, many Jews find this dilemma unbearable. That is, the dilemma of living in a world in which they want to be liberal, they want to support Israel, and Israel is like not liberal. Many Jews find this dilemma unbearable. They either ignore the remorseless hostility to Israel and push her to behave liberally in a zone deeply hostile to liberal values, or they allow a bad situation to worsen, the occupation, reluctantly siding within Israel, which behaves in ways seemingly profoundly at odds with their liberal values. With the consistent failure of Green Line peace efforts, the response has consistently tended towards greater impatience with Israel. I'm repeating myself, but this is important. I mean, and in fact, I'm referring to a particularly loathsome article by a guy named Larry Dürfner, who writes for 972 now. And it was, you know, along with the Kiva Eldar, it's the same kind of thinking. And basically what he said is, you know, I'm growing increasingly impatient with Israel, and you know, although I don't like the people I'm getting into bed with in the BDS movement, basically it's better than the option of the occupation, which is just unbearable. Largely, this desire to force Israel into the concessions it unreasonably refuses to make translates into the effort to turn Western powers and world opinion against Israel. A progressive Jew, somebody on my class list, wrote to the list about how he hopes that Obama will use the remaining period of his presidency to pressure Israel. I just wish Obama would use his time in pushing Netanyahu towards a reasonable compromise with the Palestinian people. And mind you, I mean, this guy's no dope. This guy is no dope whatsoever, but a reasonable compromise on Palestine, probably through approving a tough resolution at the UN Security Council, probably after the November elections. In other words, Obama's parting scorpion kiss, you know, would be to stick it to Israel and to, you know, yet one more wall protecting Israel from the insanity that faces it will be down. So certain is he that this email solution is reasonable that he's willing to mobilize international forces against Israel. For some, the cognitive dissonance involved in realizing that the best, the liberal strategy will not work, becomes unbearable. Some resolve this by adopting what Mati Friedman calls the cult of the occupation, where the Israeli occupation becomes a symbol, a manifestation of an evil so great that it must be opposed at any cost. Here the occupation becomes a goal and not a means. Right? So Friedman describes, so prevalent is this kind of thinking become that participating in liberal intellectual life in the West, and I can attest to this at a not particularly radical school, Boston University, but so prevalent is this kind of thinking become that participating in liberal intellectual life in the West increasingly requires you to subscribe at least outwardly to this dogma, particularly if you're a Jew and thus suspected of the wrong sympathies. Everybody here has the wrong sympathies. If you're a Jew from Israel, your participation is increasingly conditional on an abject and public display of self-flagellation. Your participation is increasingly unwelcome. Advocates of intersectionality. How many people here know what intersectionality is? Okay, so intersectionality, just briefly put, is that all forms of oppression are interconnected. And once you've identified the sort of key players that are involved, everything then becomes the result of the same process. So this is what's enabled the argument that, you know, made it yeah, Black Lives Matter, Palestinian Lives Matter, that pink washing as well. But essentially, that's how you can get things like Gays for Palestine, which represents.
Or Ferguson is house.
Right, Ferguson, that's the word I was looking for. Okay, so this intersectionality, we're on the wrong side of the intersection. We are white, we're privileged, and therefore, whatever we get, we deserve, and whatever we do is bad. Advocates of intersectionality have identified Israel as a worldwide purveyor of oppression, the epitome of racist, imperialist, apartheid, colonialist, whatever, that the ideology has now, and that ideology has now penetrated the highest levels of J Street, where J Street U recently elected as president a Muslim woman who is a perfect spokesman for this worldview. And that is the new head of J Street. And if you speak to students who are at J Street U, they will tell you how proud they are that they have a Muslim who is the head of their organization. Look at how open we are. There was in the 60s, 70s, all those years tend to blend together, there was a bumper sticker that said, "The mind is like a parachute. It only works if it's open." Right? To which the response was, "Yeah, but it only works once if it can't close." And in fact, in doing so, progressive members of the cult of the occupation ally themselves with the very forces of Palestinian irredentism that give Israelis reservations about the two-state solution. In other words, rather than listening to Israeli concerns, this argument, frustrated in achieving its simple, emailable solution, ends up supporting those who would, and here I'm quoting a sign from one demonstration, destroy Israel for world peace. And this isn't just a Palestinian problem, it's a goal that permeates the Arab and Muslim world. Indeed, it lies at the core of global jihad. Hence a goal that is problematic not just for Israel, but for the whole world, including non-triumphalist Muslims. So the real problem here is that by adopting this narrative in which Israel is by adopting the cult of the occupation, the left has essentially aligned itself with the war goals of jihad. Right? Now, they seem to think that they're the ones who are running this particular alliance. Just like if you read, and I recommend that you all go back and read Batya al-Shirabia in 2005, which is now sort of like, hello. If you read Arabia, you realize that the Europeans are making this deal assuming that they are so vastly superior, both morally and civilizationally and culturally, to the Muslims with which they're making this deal, that they don't even have to think twice about these people. And what you have here is people, the left, joining in an apocalyptic narrative in which Israel is the bad guy, the Antichrist, in secular terms the Nazi, in Christian terms the Antichrist, and in Muslim terms the Dajjal, right? The sort of evil figure who has to be destroyed in the final apocalyptic battle. And you've got the left literally adopting an apocalyptic narrative, identifying a real-life apocalyptic enemy, namely us, and in the process, immensely empowering an apocalyptic narrative amongst jihadis that targets them as well. So if you will, this is a kind of own goal behavior. They're actually, and I've said this about the journalists, but I'll say it about the entire profession of information professionals who have had a huge impact on the course of the 21st century. They have essentially been conducting own goal war operations for the enemy. And they are convinced that they're doing the right thing. So, where do we go from here? What do we do with members of the cult of the occupation? Mati, for one thing, we have to recognize that we're dealing with a religious phenomenon. Mati Friedman notes, as usual with Western religions, the center of this cult is in the Holy Land. The dogma posits that the occupation is not a conflict like any other, but that is the very symbol of the conflict, that the minute state inhabited by a persecuted minority in the Middle East is in fact a symbol of the ills of the West: colonialism, nationalism, militarism, and racism. In the recent riots in Ferguson, Missouri, for example, a sign hoisted by marchers linked the unrest between African Americans and the police to end African Americans and the police to the ending Israeli rule over the Palestinians. So, do about such a wretched situation? And here I think, if I could, if I found the right people to do it, I'd like to start a journal called Disorientation. Because essentially, since the beginning of the 21st century, the West has been thoroughly disoriented in its understanding of what's happening and in the range with which it will permit possibilities to be discussed. So I think that we have one advantage, which is an unfortunate advantage, and that is that things are only going to get worse. In other words, Brussels is not the last attack on Europe. San Bernardino is not the last attack on the United States. We are entering, I think, certainly the Middle East is entering basically a 30 years war. I mean, I use that because we have the Western continent. It's possible it'll go beyond that. But we're dealing with a situation in which we're looking at an ongoing war, and I suspect that in the next 2 to 3 years, let's say outer range is 5 years, that war will hit Europe at least. That is to say that there will be regions that have seceded from Europe and are in outright hostile relations with Europe, and Europe won't know what to do.
On the right or the left?
What do you mean, Europe on the right or the left?
Well, they're gonna be
The
liberal,
Muslim side.
or what kind of states are gonna be? Nazi states, or?
Muslims.
No, Muslims.
ISIS. Muslims.
Muslims. In other words, there will be these zones urbaines sensibles, these no-go zones, which the media insists on telling us don't exist, are metastasizing, and they will become small, like Hamas stands. And because Europe is imposing on itself the same kinds of restrictions that it imposes on Israel, it's unable to resist this. So I think we're looking at a very serious decline in its quality of life for more than just economic reasons coming ahead. Now, but on the other hand, what that means is that the denial that Europeans have been in and Westerners have been in about the nature of this threat is going to be increasingly, it's going to wear thin. And we're going to get more and more people who are waking up and saying, I want to understand what's going on. And I think that one of the main... Well, let's put it this way. If you had a debate at Oxford on whether it was too late or not, and I had my choice, I'd go for too late. But yeah, in other words, if it were like a major debate, which side has the better case to make? Too late definitely has a better case to make. I mean, it's disastrous. You know, this stuff, the warnings came out in 2005 with Eurabia, while Europe slept, and America alone, and Londonistan and stuff. This all came out in the mid-aughts, and it was all dismissed as a bunch of right-wing, loopy, conspiracy alarmist nonsense. And now it's a whole lot later, possibly too late. It's never too late, but the costs are constantly rising. I mean, it's like the 30s with Hitler. You know, if the war had happened at the beginning of the 30s, there wouldn't have been 40 million dead. But it wasn't. It was delayed and delayed and delayed. The longer it was delayed, it wasn't that it was too late to defeat Nazism. It was just that the cost of defeating Nazism was rising all the time. And that's the situation I think we're in. And I think we need to mobilize in the sense of getting a message out that says, and I got to tell you, I'm not very good at this. And the title of my book will tell you why. I was not very popular amongst my colleagues at BU. You know, nobody wants to be told they're dupes. In fact, this paper that I just gave you, I submitted to a journal, and the guy wrote back and said, "Why would I publish this? You're calling me a dupe." And I said, "Are you saying it hurt your feelings?" But
Is useful idiot better?
I actually prefer useful infidel. I think that's the 21st century version, and what's so striking about the 21st century version is at least the useful idiots of the 20th century had a pretty ideology to go to lie for, right? They really believed, well, some of them really believed that communism was, a redemptive fantasy. I have a chapter on the communists and another chapter on Marx in my book on millennialism. They really thought they had a collective redemptive historical task to play. But the useful infidels are shilling and misinforming and misleading on behalf of a really ugly ideology. I mean, this is the worst of the Middle Ages. When Quentin Tarantino talks about getting medieval on you, they want to get medieval on us. This is theocracy. This is what is it called? The Game of Thrones. I mean, these guys are players from the Game of Thrones, and they're appealing to our testosteronic youth, including non-Muslim testosteronic youth, to say, yeah, this is the way to go. And it's a very powerful message, and we have to fight it. And I think we have to fight it not just at an intellectual level, but I think we have to communicate to our kids and to our grandchildren that, we're very sorry for what we've done to you, but we've bequeathed you a very bad position in a very nasty fight that has to be fought for the sake of human freedom and dignity. And these are things that both Jews and Gentiles can agree on, and democracy was born of that agreement, and it's being destroyed. It's being destroyed by people who, I don't know why. I mean, intimidation, narcissism, I think it's a combination of intimidation and narcissism. They've told themselves they're the good people. You talk to the Israeli post-Zionists, they're the good people, and the bad people are all these tribal Jews who insist on defending their people rather than opening up, and anyway. So let me close with that so that we can have some questions